King William Island lies low and exposed in the central Canadian Arctic, a flat mass of gravel, frozen marsh, and shallow bays pressed between the Victoria Strait and the Queen Maud Gulf. For most of the year, it is locked in ice. Even in summer, the land rarely softens. The ground remains hard beneath a thin skin of moss and stone, shaped by wind and cold rather than water or trees. The shoreline offers little shelter. There are no cliffs to break the weather, no forests to absorb sound. Snow moves freely across the surface, driven by winds that change direction without warning. In winter, darkness settles for months at a time. In summer, the sun circles low and constant, never fully leaving the sky. Time here is measured less by days than by temperature and light. Wildlife is scarce and unpredictable. Caribou pass through in some seasons and vanish in others. Seals appear at breathing holes in the ice, but only where conditions allow. Fish are present beneath the frozen surface, though accessing them requires effort and specialized knowledge. For long stretches, the island appears empty, with no sign of movement beyond drifting snow and distant ice. The sea surrounding King William Island is shallow and prone to freezing early. Pack ice presses inward from multiple directions, locking channels that once seemed navigable. When the ice closes, it does so gradually and then completely. Ships caught in it cannot maneuver. Over time, they become part of the landscape. This is not a place that signals danger loudly. It does not announce threat with sudden storms or violent terrain. Instead, it wears down presence slowly. Survival here depends on preparation, timing, and restraint. Without those, even well-equipped arrivals become temporary features of the land, leaving traces that may not be discovered for years. In the spring of 1845, 2 Royal Navy ships departed England with the approval and confidence of the British Admiralty. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were assigned to complete the last unmapped section of the Northwest Passage, a sea route that promised a direct connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic. Previous expeditions had charted much of the surrounding coastline. What remained was a narrow, uncertain region west of King William Island. The command was given to Sir John Franklin, a naval officer with decades of Arctic experience. He had traveled north before, both by sea and overland, and was familiar with the logistical demands of cold environments. At the time of departure, Franklin was nearly 60 years old. His appointment was seen as a final, respectable command for a veteran officer. The expedition carried 129 officers and men. Most were career sailors trained under Royal Navy discipline. Several had served in polar regions before, including Francis Crozier, captain of Terror, who had experience in Antarctic waters. The ships themselves had been modified for Arctic travel. Their hulls were reinforced with iron plating. Steam engines, adapted from railway locomotives, were installed to provide auxiliary power when wind failed. Heating systems were added, and the ships were stocked with coal to fuel them. Food supplies were intended to last at least 3 years. Much of it was preserved in tins, a relatively new technology at the time. Contracts for the canned provisions were rushed, and quality control was limited. Alongside the preserved food, the ships carried flour, tea, sugar, chocolate, alcohol, and lemon juice to prevent scurvy. Hunting equipment and fishing gear were also included, under the assumption that fresh food could supplement stored rations. The men departed with written orders but no fixed timetable. They were expected to winter where necessary, advance when conditions allowed, and return once the passage had been charted. Communication with the outside world was not possible after departure. Once the ships entered the Arctic, the expedition existed beyond immediate reach of rescue or resupply. In July 1845, Erebus and Terror were last seen by European whalers in Baffin Bay. At that point, the crews appeared healthy. The ships were intact and fully provisioned. From there, they continued westward into waters that had defeated or delayed previous expeditions. The journey ahead was considered difficult but achievable. Nothing in the early stages suggested that the voyage would end in abandonment, prolonged suffering, or disappearance. By the late summer of 1846, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had reached the western side of King William Island. The ships entered Victoria Strait, a narrow channel known for unstable ice conditions. Initially, the passage appeared navigable. The season had been favorable, and the crews advanced steadily southward. As autumn approached, temperatures dropped earlier than expected. Ice began to form along the edges of the strait, thickening day by day. Movement slowed. The auxiliary steam engines were used to push through forming floes, but their power was limited. Before the ships could reach open water, the channel closed around them. Once frozen in, the ships could not be freed by manpower or machinery. The pressure of the ice locked the hulls in place. Attempts to saw or blast a path would have been impractical and dangerous. The expedition prepared to overwinter, following procedures familiar to polar crews. Tents were erected on the ice. Supplies were rationed. The ships were insulated as well as possible. The winter of 1846 to 1847 passed with no opportunity for escape. When spring returned, the ice did not break as anticipated. Summer brought only partial thawing. The ships remained immobilized, surrounded by solid ice fields that extended in all directions. The situation repeated itself through a second winter. This prolonged entrapment marked a turning point. The expedition had not planned for multiple consecutive winters in the same location. Coal supplies were consumed at a steady rate. Food stores diminished. Hunting opportunities were limited and inconsistent. The surrounding land offered little relief. By April 1848, nearly 2 years after becoming icebound, the decision was made to abandon the ships. An official record, later recovered, stated that Sir John Franklin had died the previous year, in June 1847. Command had passed to Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames. The ships were left in the ice, still upright but silent. The men prepared to travel south on foot, hauling boats and supplies toward the mouth of the Back River, where they hoped to reach known trading posts. From this point forward, the expedition would no longer be defined by naval procedure but by endurance on land. The isolation was no longer temporary. It had become absolute. When the decision to abandon HMS Erebus and HMS Terror was carried out in April 1848, the men of the expedition transitioned from naval routine to overland survival. The ships had provided structure, shelter, and relative warmth. On the ice and land, those systems had to be recreated with limited means. Before departure, the crews salvaged what they could carry. Boats were removed from the ships and mounted on sledges. These were intended for river travel if open water was reached, but for now they served as cargo platforms. Food, clothing, firearms, ammunition, cooking equipment, and navigation instruments were loaded. Each item reflected a calculation about necessity and weight. Even so, the loads were heavy. The terrain ahead offered no roads or smooth paths, only uneven ice, gravel ridges, and snow. The men organized themselves into groups under officers and petty officers. Discipline remained in place, at least formally. Watches were kept. Rations were issued according to regulation. Daily distances were planned rather than improvised. The intent was to preserve order as long as possible, relying on familiarity rather than adaptation. Movement was slow. Hauling the boats required coordinated effort, and progress depended on ice conditions that changed from hour to hour. Soft snow could halt a sledge entirely. Hard ice could cut through boots and damage runners. When pressure ridges blocked the route, the boats had to be unloaded and dragged separately over uneven ground. Shelter at night was minimal. Tents were erected when conditions allowed, but fuel for heating was limited. Coal had been taken from the ships, but it was heavy and consumed quickly. Fires were used sparingly. Clothing was layered and reused despite moisture and wear. Drying garments was difficult, and frost damage accumulated gradually. Food supplies consisted largely of preserved rations carried from the ships. These included canned meat, biscuits, flour, and chocolate. The quality of some provisions had already declined during the winters aboard ship. There is evidence from later examination that some tins were improperly sealed, leading to spoilage. Fresh food was scarce. Hunting parties occasionally succeeded in taking birds or small animals, but such opportunities were unpredictable and insufficient for the size of the group. The men also attempted fishing when open leads appeared, though success varied. Equipment was basic, and access to water was often obstructed by ice thickness. Seal hunting required locating breathing holes, a skill known to Inuit hunters but unfamiliar to most of the expedition. Without local guidance, these efforts yielded little. As weeks passed, physical strain increased. Scurvy, despite the presence of lemon juice in theory, appears to have affected the crew. Symptoms included weakness, joint pain, and impaired wound healing. Cold injuries were common. Frostbite damaged fingers, toes, and faces. Small injuries became serious due to exhaustion and malnutrition. Mental discipline became as important as physical effort. Officers continued to enforce routine where possible. Marching hours were observed. Camps were set up according to plan rather than impulse. Records were kept, at least initially. This adherence to structure reflected both training and necessity. Without it, the group risked fragmenting. The landscape offered no reassurance. King William Island and the surrounding mainland provided few landmarks. Navigation depended on charts that were incomplete and sometimes inaccurate. Weather frequently obscured visibility. Progress southward was measured in miles that felt disproportionate to the effort required. Evidence recovered decades later suggests that some men attempted to lighten their loads as conditions worsened. Items such as books, cutlery, and personal effects were discarded along the route. These objects, unnecessary for immediate survival, indicate the tension between preparation and reality. What had seemed reasonable to carry at the outset became unsustainable over time. Despite these challenges, the group continued. There is no indication of immediate panic or disorder during the early stages of the march. The men moved because remaining near the ships offered no prospect of improvement. The ice had not released them once, and there was no reason to believe it would now. As the journey extended into late spring and early summer, ice conditions changed again. Thawing created slush and open water that slowed progress further. Boots soaked through. Sledges bogged down. In some cases, boats had to be carried rather than dragged. The environment imposed decisions continuously. When to stop. When to press on. When to consume limited fuel or save it. Each choice narrowed future options. The expedition operated without external reference points, relying solely on internal judgment and diminishing strength. Over time, the uniformity of the group began to break down. Some men fell behind. Others were reassigned to assist them. Deaths occurred, though exact numbers and dates remain uncertain. Burials were conducted when possible, marked with stones or simple graves. In other cases, bodies were left where they fell, the ground too hard or conditions too severe for formal burial. Archaeological evidence indicates that as losses mounted, survival practices changed. Cut marks on human bones found along the route suggest that cannibalism occurred. This conclusion is supported by multiple independent examinations and aligns with Inuit oral accounts recorded in the years following the expedition's disappearance. These acts were not documented by the expedition itself and were likely carried out under extreme conditions rather than as a planned strategy. The shift toward such measures reflects the collapse of earlier assumptions. Rations were gone or unusable. Hunting had failed to provide enough sustenance. Physical deterioration limited mobility. Under these circumstances, survival became immediate rather than procedural. Still, there is no evidence of a single moment when order fully dissolved. The transition appears gradual. Even as conditions worsened, some structure remained. Boats continued to be hauled. Routes continued to be followed. The goal of reaching the back river remained, even as it grew increasingly distant. By the time the group moved beyond King William Island onto the mainland, they were operating at the edge of endurance. Supplies were critically low. The number of able-bodied men had declined. The environment offered no recovery period. What had begun as a planned retreat transformed into a prolonged test of survival with diminishing returns. The systems that had sustained the expedition, naval discipline, stored provisions, mechanical assistance, had been reduced to fragments. What remained was effort applied against a landscape that did not respond. As the march continued, the physical condition of the remaining men deteriorated in visible and compounding ways. Weight loss was severe. Contemporary naval standards recorded body mass and ration needs carefully, but those calculations no longer applied. Caloric intake fell far below what sustained movement in cold environments required. Strength declined unevenly, creating gaps between individuals that were difficult to manage. Illness spread quietly. Scurvy, likely exacerbated by ineffective preservation of citrus supplies and prolonged deficiency, impaired mobility and judgment. Joints stiffened. Gums swelled and bled. Wounds that might otherwise have healed remained open. Infection became a persistent risk in a setting where cleanliness could not be maintained. Cold injuries accumulated. Frostbite reduced dexterity, making basic tasks, handling tools, loading sledges, preparing food, more difficult with each passing week. Some men were no longer able to walk without assistance. Others collapsed during travel and could not be revived. The burden on those still capable increased accordingly. Decision-making narrowed. Officers faced choices that had no favorable outcomes. Waiting risked starvation. Moving risked collapse. Splitting the group might improve speed for some but guaranteed abandonment for others. Evidence suggests that the party fragmented over time, either intentionally or through attrition, though the sequence and structure of these divisions remain uncertain. Material traces from the route reflect this breakdown. Boats were abandoned partway through the journey, left upright or overturned. Skeletons were later found near them, indicating that progress had halted entirely at certain points. Some remains showed signs of deliberate dismemberment, consistent with survival cannibalism under extreme conditions. These findings align with Inuit testimony collected in the 1850s, which described starving men traveling south and dying along the coast. Psychological strain increased as predictability disappeared. Routine, once enforced, became difficult to sustain. Days blurred as progress slowed to a crawl. Weather dictated movement more than planning. Silence replaced conversation as energy was conserved. There is no surviving record of morale, only the physical evidence of decline. Deaths became more frequent. Without the ability to carry the fallen, the living moved on. In some cases, bodies were covered with stones or placed near recognizable features. In others, they were left exposed. Each loss reduced the group's capacity further, accelerating the process. By the later stages of the journey, survival no longer followed a system. It became reactive. Actions were taken to address immediate needs rather than long-term goals. The intention to reach the back river persisted in theory, but the means to do so had largely vanished. The march did not end with a final decision or event. It diminished gradually, as strength failed and numbers dwindled. What remained of the expedition was scattered across hundreds of miles of coastline, marked only by abandoned equipment and human remains. No written record describes the final days of the Franklin expedition's overland retreat. What is known comes from fragments left behind and from accounts gathered years later by search parties and Inuit witnesses. Together, they indicate that the southward movement eventually ceased without reaching its intended destination. Some men appear to have died along the western coast of King William Island. Others made it onto the mainland, progressing toward the back river but stopping well short of any established outposts. The distance remaining varied, but even the closest groups were still far from reliable assistance. By that stage, the river itself would have posed a further challenge, swollen by seasonal melt and difficult to navigate without strength or supplies. There is no evidence of a single encampment marking the end. Instead, the expedition faded across the landscape. Isolated skeletons, small clusters of remains, and abandoned equipment suggest that the final phase unfolded unevenly. Individuals and small groups succumbed where they could no longer continue. Search expeditions in the following decades recovered scattered artifacts, buttons, utensils, fragments of uniforms, and personal items. These objects confirmed identity but offered no narrative. They showed that the men carried their naval roles with them until movement was no longer possible. The ships themselves remained locked in ice for years after abandonment. When they were eventually located in the 21st century, they were found intact on the seabed, far from where their crews had last walked away. Their condition suggested no sudden disaster at sea, only prolonged immobility. No member of the expedition survived to reach help or return with an account. The march south did not fail dramatically. It ended quietly, one loss at a time, until there was no one left to continue. The disappearance of the Franklin expedition left no immediate conclusion. For years, its fate was unknown, inferred only through absence. When evidence finally emerged, it did so slowly, through recovered documents, artifacts, and human remains scattered across a wide region. What became clear was not a single cause but a convergence of limits. Technology that functioned in theory failed under prolonged conditions. Planning based on seasonal release proved incompatible with the ice's persistence. Discipline and structure delayed collapse but could not prevent it. The men endured longer than many before them, yet endurance alone was insufficient. King William Island retained the record. Not in writing, but in placement. In the alignment of bones. In discarded equipment. In ships left behind rather than destroyed. The landscape absorbed the expedition without comment. The final march was never completed because there was no remaining margin. Each step south reduced what little capacity remained. Survival narrowed until movement itself became impossible. The end did not announce itself. It simply arrived. The significance of the expedition lies less in its ambition than in its outcome. It illustrates the boundary between preparation and uncertainty, and the cost of operating beyond immediate support. The men were not reckless. They were committed to a system that could not adapt fast enough. When the Arctic ice closed again, it erased the last traces of activity. What remained was silence, and a lesson recorded not in triumph or failure, but in absence.